Hi. Hello. Hi. Hello, everyone. You're. Hi. Good evening. Happy Wednesday. Happy Hump Day. It's been a few weeks since I've seen you guys. Um, Hoping that my guest is on. I don't see him as yet, or I may have missed him. Um, in any event, welcome to the Becky Brown Girl Show. Happy Wednesday. Like I said, it's been a couple weeks since I've seen you guys, but I'm back to talk about a topic that I think is important, um, that you guys should think is important, and that is the upcoming presidential election in November. I have a guest who's going to be joining me shortly, but before I add him, I just kind of wanted to talk about why I wanted to talk about this topic. Generally, and I've said before, I like to avoid politics because it can be a little bit tricky. And so my intention is not to express to you who I think you should or shouldn't vote for. It's really just to talk about some of the issues around this particular election that you may not be familiar with or aware of, for those of you who don't find politics particularly interesting or sexy, or it's boring, or you just think it's a waste of your time. But we're going to talk about why it is important for you to care, and again, some of the issues that specifically are relevant in this particular upcoming election. A lot going on around politics right now, but again, we're going to get into that shortly. I'd like to go ahead and add my guest. His name is Thomas Varela. He is the executive director of the New Jersey Black Empowerment Coalition. NJBEC is a statewide nonprofit organization at the intersection of policy, inclusive democracy, and active citizenship, working towards racial justice in New Jersey. This organization educates key stakeholders and the broader public about relevant policy issues, encouraging active citizenship and voter participation to achieve sustainable change. So let me go ahead and add Thomas. Who's interested in joining. Just for right now, I'm going to add Thomas, and as the conversation goes on, I may want to add other folks depending on what you guys are talking about in the comments. Welcome, Thomas.
Hey, good evening. Good evening. How are you?
Wonderful. So I don't know if you heard me doing your introduction.
Yeah, no, I heard it. I heard it. Appreciate that.
Okay, great. So if there's anything else that you want to share about yourself that you think is important, you want the folks to follow you, your organization, please put your information in the chat. That's NJBEC _.
Yeah,
So go follow them
yeah,
on IG. Um,
yeah. I really appreciate you having me, giving me a chance to kind of talk about this topic. Voting, civic participation, elections. I think one of the things we recognize is that every 4 years, elections become this big marketing ploy, marketing push, where there's a lot of energy in terms of the presidential. And then many times we lose sight of local elections and state elections, and because we lose sight of some of that local stuff, we become jaded with the presidential, because then it's like, why are we only focused on the presidential? It's the same song and dance. They're about to go get 2 Chainz to come talk to me about voting. I don't want to hear the next rapper tell me this, et cetera, et cetera. And so then we get frustrated and we become apathetic. And the status quo kind of wants that apathy. And so we're really excited to kind of push back against that and kind of talk, kind of reimagine when we think about civic participation, and have that honest conversation about voting. As much as we know it's phrased as Biden versus Trump, it's more than just Biden and Trump. And hopefully we can kind of talk about that in a nonpartisan way. And just want to put that disclaimer out there. I'm here representing my organization. We're a 501c3. I'm not ready to get fired off of you all in the audience, so I'm not here going to tell you to vote for Biden or Trump. I leave that up to you as the voter. But we hope to have an honest conversation around how we think about the candidates, the administration, and more importantly, how we as citizens participate in government.
I literally could not have said that better myself, and I concur. So any opinions expressed out of my mouth are my opinions and my opinions alone. But once again, all we're doing is sharing information and then leaving it up to you. I know there are people who are kind of probably dug in on either side, but for the folks who may not be sure if they want to participate, if they're independent, or if they haven't made a decision, maybe this will help inform which way you go. Because ultimately, the goal is to not vote out of ignorance or not vote at all because you're apathetic. It's to be engaged in the process because there is no process without the people, right? So they say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's our government. It's our government, and the government's going to continue to do its thing if we participate or not. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that our tax dollars go into this work. All these elected officials work for us. But if we choose to fall back and throw our hands up and say, forget all this, government's going to just say, I bet we're going to take your dollars and we're going to continue to cook. And I think that's something that we kind of got to be mindful of, is that government's going to cook with us or without us. And we got to ask ourselves, are we going to play a part in determining how government functions?
Once again, see, I'm gonna just let you take over.
And real quick, I'm gonna try to make sure I don't curse or none of those words, but hopefully I have freedom to kind of, let loose if I need to.
Say, listen, break it down and let it be broke. Make it plain for the folk.
No doubt.
Bars.
All right, no doubt. There it is.
Okay, so as I mentioned on the flyer, advertising the show, we wanted to talk about Project 2025. We wanted to talk about the Democratic platform, and some of the items that are on Trump's agenda. So again, you have information on both sides, relative to how you want to move forward, and hopefully you're all registered. I'm assuming if you're on here that you do have some interest in this topic, which is good news. Each one teach one, right? Anyway.
Definitely.
So, I also want to add, though, that I think it's important because I know a lot of people don't necessarily watch traditional news anymore.
Yeah.
They get a lot of their information from social media, which is not always, the most accurate place, depending on what the source is. So I'm not suggesting that we're not providing truthful or accurate information, but you should be doing your own research,
Yeah.
As a follow-up if you're not already.
And just to that point, I got my tablet. I'm not going to necessarily talk off the cuff with everything. I'm going to try my best to provide as much information as possible where you can find it. But I think you make an interesting point right now. Traditional news is being broken down in a way, the way that young people and people in general get information. It's important that, one of the things that's interesting is that we have to ask ourselves, is this information different than what we're used to, or is it actually misinformation, right? Because there is a difference, right? There are foreign agents that literally are targeting Black people to basically encourage us to be apathetic, right? There's foreign agents. There's literally the government did a report and found that foreign agents are targeting us to leverage our frustration with government, because we know with history of government, it hasn't always served our people well. So we have a healthy frustration, but that frustration is being hustled, because if that frustration is telling you to not participate in the fundamental right of all Americans, which is to vote, then you got to ask yourself, every other community votes, right? That's how you communicate to your government, like, yo, I'm here. I complete the census, I participate in voting. That's how you talk to your government. So if an entity is telling you to fall back from voting, it's basically telling you not to participate in what's fundamental as being an American. And so then you got to ask yourself, why, if you're telling me to fall back, how can I really trust you in that, right? And so I think that's something that we have to, be honest about, right? Because on the one hand, we're seeing information being democratized. Like we're not going to CNN and MSNBC. We're seeing new platforms like even a recent report, the Shade Room recently had a feature where the Shade Room is saying like, nah, we're trying to pivot away from gossip because they have all this following and they're realizing like we may need to pivot how we present ourselves and be beyond just gossip. And so that presents a new audience of people that are going to digest information. And ultimately, we got to ask ourselves that new information, is it true information? Is it op-ed or is it misinformation, right? Because there's opinion, then there's research through NPR and some of your traditional platforms, and then there's misinformation. And then we have to make sure that we're not being hustled by that misinformation.
Well, I will say to the point that you just made, one of the ways, in which we communicate information on my day job is ensuring that we have credible messengers representing the communities that we serve. People that they're familiar with, that they're acquainted with, that they trust, right?
Yeah,
Similarly, people want to go to sources that they trust. Now, it may reinforce their ideas, it may challenge their ideas, but again, it depends on how critically you think about this or how engaged you are in the process. And there's going to be a wide spectrum of how interested or disinterested people are in this topic. Like a lot of people just tune out with politics because once again they think it's,
yeah,
you know
yeah,
they're not for us, it doesn't serve us, and they don't necessarily understand how it will impact you whether you care or not. Um,
yeah.
so in
No,
any case,
and I do want to name that part, right? Like one of the things we got to be honest, right? Our community is starting to entertain news sources. If we think about campaigns, Biden, Trump, they're entertaining what Trump is saying in a different way, right? And so those may be viewed as like when I say non-traditional, meaning like our community have historically not really resonated with Republican policies, right? In terms of, or Republican talking points, so to speak, right? But in this campaign, we're seeing energy. Trump's in the hood in a way that some folks may be feeling like that's inauthentic. Some folks feel like, yo, this is my first time being heard. So I'm willing to resonate with that. And so now we got to figure out how do we think through that, right? Because if we weren't accustomed to hearing Republican talking points, then we got to ask ourselves, are those talking points legit or are those talking points not legit? Because once again, we've seen foreign agents kind of leverage our frustration. And so we got to be honest about how do we think about that. And I think we talked about that before. Black folks are not monolithic. There's many folks in your chat that probably could argue being conservative voting, but then there's, in terms of how they think about certain policies, but then there's also the broader conversation around how we think about Black people as a collective, or are we thinking about our own individual situation? Because financially, we could be leaning more conservative, but then reproductive health, we might be leaning more liberal. Education, we might be in the middle. There's all these different things that we have to be honest about as we think about our politics, because we are becoming less monolithic when we think about, but we still historically recognize that Black folks get information a certain way, right? When we think about our politics. And because we recognize that there's potentially a broader implication. And so we got to really think, we got to be honest about those conversations. And once again, recognize that if we're going to vote, we're voting on the issues. And if we're standing on our principles as being conservative, then be legit. But be careful that you don't got a battery in your back. And I think that's what we have to be careful, especially as more people are entering in this space that hasn't historically been involved in politics. They may be parroting talking points that is based off of a battery in their back versus actually being rooted in those policies. And I think that's why it's important to think about those trusted messengers. There are organizations that literally do this work, think tanks like the Black Economic Alliance, the Joint Center, the National Urban League, that literally are steep in policy and more times than not have been vying in our best interest. And at the same time, there's the Woodson Center on the conservative side that is Black led, that has tried to champion conservative policies. for some folks, they resonated with that, right? So at the end of the day, we have to be honest about how we think about our politics, and then once again think about our personal politics, and then our politics as Black folks, right? Because we talk about one Black agenda. So how do we wrestle with we're not monolithic, but we want one Black agenda?
Well, listen, the people already said you spitting.
I
I'm gonna let you take
appreciate
over.
that. Nah, I appreciate that.
There's a couple things I wanted to piggyback off of that you mentioned in your last comments. One was I'm old now, so my memory is short.
Nah, you good.
One is about meeting people where they are.
Yep.
The other was darn it, it's gonna come back to me.
Well, we can
Hold on one second.
focus on that one, meeting people where they are.
Yes. So to your point about Black people not being monolithic, um, they're obviously going to find their sources in a bunch of different places. Like you just dropped the names of a bunch of different organizations, but probably, a lot of people aren't necessarily going to go to those sources. I don't know how much outreach they're doing in the communities to engage with people who may not traditionally be, their voting block or whatever. Like you had made a point when we spoke earlier about how when they are seeking our vote, there are certain places that they're more likely to go because those people are traditionally the people who vote, like
Yeah.
churches.
Yeah.
They're not going to, I don't know, they're not going to the corner. Like,
No, I mean,
maybe they are. I know that there's
I'm,
some
I'm,
door-to-door outreach
yeah,
that
no,
takes
definitely.
place, but
I think, we see that, right? Like I'm in the Philly region right now, South Jersey specific, but I went to Temple for undergrad. They're not going to always go to the bottom, right? They're not going to go all the way uptown all the time unless they're going to go up Chestnut Hill or go to Mount Airy in Philly. They may not go into the trenches of North Philly and Nicetown. And so at the end of the day, but I think part of the reason why that happens that way is because it's a chicken and egg, right? One of the things that we are passionate about as an organization is how do we create more super voters, right? Because one of the marks that we talk about is that politicians don't listen to Black people; they listen to Black voters, because it is a voter who determines if you win or lose a race, not people, right?
Mhm.
You and I could just be talking, but at the end of the day, when they determine who wins a race, they're counting votes.
Yeah.
And so we have to create super voters. And so the campaigns, both left and right, are going to historically go to the spaces where super voters exist. So that has been your churches, your social clubs, your fraternities and sororities, because they have a track record of voting in every election, right? Because one of the things that we think about um, with campaigns, right? Campaigns have a limited amount of money, right? And so campaigns prioritize how they focus on voting. How do they focus on who they're going to target based on the data? And so they will go back in data and say, oh, this person, I'll use an example. I'll use an example. Like they'll look at a person in the urban community. They'll say, all right, this person votes every 4 years. They're not voting in every election, right?
Mhm.
So a campaign then says, all right, that means I got to spend money to convince them to vote off top. I got to spend money to convince you to vote. Then I got to spend money to convince you to vote for me. So that's two things you got to do. Versus if you're a super voter, all I got to do is pay money to convince you to vote for me. So you're actually cheaper for me as a campaign if you're a super voter. And so that's why they prioritize the super voters, because they recognize that you're more likely to vote, and ultimately I need voters to win. And so I think that's why it's really important that we have to really look at how we participate, right? Because on the one hand, we feel frustrated, and so then we stop voting, and then it feeds a feedback loop. We stop participating. The campaigns say, y'all don't care, so we're not going to target you. Then our community says, y'all not targeting us, so I'm going to continue to not to vote. Then the campaign says, bet, you're continuing to show me that you don't care, so I'm going to continue to ignore you. And so I think, and it's frustrating because to a certain extent, we can feel like, yo, we vote in certain numbers and they're gonna ignore us anyways. But there could be an argument in some instances that we're actually not voting, we're not meeting our numbers the way that we could, right? We could be doing more. How do we overwhelm the system? Even if, once again, it can feel frustrating that we got to make the first move or we got to continue to make the move. But at some point, if we can overwhelm the system, the campaigns will respond back because they're ultimately trying to chase votes.
Well, and there are other, voting blocks, right? That they know you better answer and respond to whatever their agenda is, their issues are, because they contribute to campaigns
Yep.
to the point that you made. So it's
Yep.
not just about like them coming out and voting, them where them dollars at. Them dollars also have a big influence on what agendas that
Yep.
they're pushing.
Yep.
So
And that's a real point, right? One of the things that we know in our community, unfortunately, is we tend, when we participate in democracy, we tend to vote, but we don't always support campaigns. We don't always cut the checks. And so what can sometimes happen is a campaign or a candidate will come into our community, ask for our vote, and we vote for them, but then they end up following the money in terms of their policy, right? Because we're not participating fully and holistically in all of democracy, right? Voting is like step one. Then it's accountability. How are we monitoring the votes that these elected officials are taking? How are we monitoring the votes that they're not taking? And in some cases, how are we supporting them in terms of donations and making contributions to their campaigns to kind of show that we support their work or not? And so at the end of the day, campaigns many times are going to operate with limited funds, and especially Black and Brown candidates, they don't always have the disposable income like other communities to just run with paying their own campaign. So then they become beholden to whoever's cutting the check.
listen, as the people said, you spitting. you're you are 1,000% right. Now I kind of want to, I definitely want to talk about Project 2025 because I know that is a big reason why people were, interested in watching the show. I want to talk about Biden's agenda, but before we get into that, just really quickly, I want you to kind of touch on the point of the local engagement, local participation, and why it's important to pay attention and participate in the local elections because they impact you the most directly.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, as they always say, all politics is local. There's a marriage between federal, state, and local politics, right? But we also have to remember the foundation of our government. Government is a collection of 50 states and in one country. And so what does that mean? In some instances, we will care about the mayor in our city, and then we'll care about the president of our country, but we don't always think about the state legislature, right? And in some cases, if we think about, the South, for instance, where Black folks are disproportionately located, you have a lot of Black folks in cities that are dealing with state governments that are not allowing certain policies to be implemented. Let's look at the news in Jackson, Mississippi. There was federal dollars that the Biden administration tried to send to Jackson to try to address some of the lead in their water, but that money got sent to the state because the country is federal and state. And so because it got sent to the state was able to determine how to try to spend that money. And what ended up happening was they weren't as willing because of the divided government in terms of Jackson being a Democrat city and Mississippi being a Republican state. They weren't willing to use those dollars to address the water issue. And so then it becomes becomes that kind of tug of war between state and local. So it's really important that when we think about participating, we are recognizing all three levels and what happens in each level, right? On a city level, you're dealing with trash pickup. You're dealing in some cases with school districts. You're dealing with policing in some instances, right? On a state level, you're dealing with public education. You're dealing with, every budget money is allocated to, um, education, infrastructure. For those, once again, we're in New Jersey, so there's been a lot of attention right now around transportation and New Jersey Transit or trains, going from New York to Jersey, things like that. That's federal, that's state dollars that figure out how much money is allocated. Policing, healthcare, those are federal dollars. Minimum wage, right? Pennsylvania right now, minimum wage is 7.25.
What?
Yeah,
What?
and 7.25. Every state that surrounds Pennsylvania has a minimum wage that's higher than Pennsylvania, right? And so that's determined on a state level. Marijuana usage, that's determined on a state level through a ballot referendum or the legislature implementing that, right?
Yep.
Reform. I know in Jersey, for instance, Governor Murphy just announced a new policy around clemency that around people being their crimes being expunged and clemency and things like that. That's done on a state level. So once again, and then on a federal level, right? Like an example, Trump, during his term, he talked about the First Step Act and the fact that he enacted this policy that was addressing folks that were impacted by the criminal justice system, but that was done on a federal level. One thing to keep in mind: most crimes are state and local issues. So yes, Trump is able to claim that as a win, but we do have to then ask ourselves, what's the measurable impact of that federal legislation when ultimately most issues around criminal justice are state and local issues?
Well, one thing I will say, and once again, I'm not making a judgment about who you should or shouldn't vote for. I will just say about him is that he knows how to market
Yeah.
his message
Mm-hmm.
in a way that seems to resonate with a lot of different people. Listen, before I go
Yeah.
off with a tangent.
Well, I think that's that's one of the things that makes sense. You know what I mean? To a certain extent, elections and campaigns is a marketing campaign. The president is the spokesperson, right?
Mhm.
So, I think that's something that folks have to be, when they do the research to think about who they're going to vote for. One of the things that folks have to look at is like, how do you dig into the policies versus just talking points that are shared, right? At the end of the day, you have to look at the policies, and the policies are not just Biden or Trump policies. It's Democrat administration versus Republican administration, right? At the end of the day, you are picking a person that will determine the administration that governs us, right? So at the end of the day, that's how you got to think about politics.
So, I just really quickly want to touch on something that Legend is the Elder said before we get into the Project 2025 discussion. But Legend is the Elder says he wants something equivalent to the Asian Protection Act for Blacks. How do you think that they got that act passed? Because they unified around a message, right? And I don't know to what extent they're, supporting candidates, that they're donating. I'm not sure. But once again, we are not a monolith, but there has to be some level of unification on a message, on a um you know whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. Like, we're not going to achieve everything, right? So
Yeah.
we have to prioritize our goals, and then focus on what define what the top 1-2 goals are. Focus on getting those accomplished in an administration, but we also have to go out and vote for the people who are committing to advancing those agendas and continuing to hold them accountable. Just like Thomas said, pass the election. Like, we vote and then we don't care again until it's time to vote. They have no concern or interest in ensuring that they're implementing what you're asking for, because you're not applying pressure and holding them accountable.
Yeah.
Um,
No, and I think, but to clarify, and I think this is where one of the things that we have to be careful when we think about legislation, right? Because yes, the anti-Asian, whatever the way it's phrased, the anti-Asian hate bill. Well, let me take that back. The way we in the community tend to frame it is the anti-Asian hate bill, but it was the incidents that Asians were experiencing like manifested the legislation. But I think sometimes when I hear that phrase, it comes off as if only Asians benefit from that. And that's incorrect. Like whatever that legislation, everyone is able to benefit from that. Yes, it was the the issues that Asians were dealing with during that time that created the incentive to develop this legislation, but it's open to everyone when we think about hate crimes. The hate crimes in the legislation, it doesn't just say this bill is only for Asian people, right? It's the same thing with like with like civil rights with the black people in the 60s. When they leveraged the issues that black people were dealing with in the 60s, affirmative action became one of the legislation that was open to not just black people. And as we know, white women benefit from affirmative action more than any other group. But that's something that's important to keep in mind, that yes, there was an incident that may have led to legislation, but it wasn't exclusive to one race. And I think that's it. And I think we got to be careful with that, because that's when we frame it as Asians got this, it creates the divide, right? Because now we start to say Asians got this, how come black people didn't get that? When that legislation that was created around anti-hate does benefit to other people as well.
Okay, so um, let's pivot from local back to the national elections and talk about some of the platforms that are being discussed, and for potential implementation, depending on which party gets elected,
Yeah.
right? So, starting with Project 2025. Now, um, Trump has said this is not his policy agenda. However, the Heritage Foundation, who put these tenants together, did assist with identifying cabinet members for him in his prior administration, and there's a very close and symbiotic relationship with that entity. So he is currently trying to distance himself because now that more people are becoming familiar with it, it doesn't seem, as popular broadly as it does among like staunch conservatives. But
Mm-hmm.
just to kind of summarize what it is, it's a conservative political agenda that's designed, if a conservative is elected, to implement sweeping reforms across the government based on four pillars, which is building on a conservative policy agenda, making sweeping changes of personnel across the federal government, training this new personnel on core principles of conservatism, and the rapid implementation of some of these policies within the first 6 months of a new conservative administration. Um, some of the agenda items that they're trying to advance are eliminating the Department of Education, using public funds to pay for private religious schools, um, dismantling civil rights and DEI protections in all levels of government, um, total ban on abortions, regardless of viability or health of the mother, banning contraceptives, banning African American and gender studies in all levels of education, tax cuts for major corporations, and but while increasing taxes on, wait a minute, basically increasing taxes on the middle class, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, eliminating climate protections, encouraging Arctic drilling, um, eliminating regulations of big business and oil, raising the retirement age, um, forcing immigrants to be deported or held in camps, and ending birthright citizenship, banning Muslims from entering the country, dismantling a number of different existing government entities like the FDA and EPA, which is crazy. Um, well, a lot of these things are crazy, but anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, eliminating Social Security for the elderly and disabled, um, hacking the Supreme Court. There's 22 tenants that I found on the agenda. But again, I encourage all of you to research it further, um, to better understand. Now, once again, Trump has said this is not his agenda, but it is framed as the agenda of the transitional team once a conservative um, candidate is elected to, you know, to be the next president, which of course in this case is Trump. So, so that is Project 2025. I don't know if you have any additional comments on that before I sort of go into Biden's agenda.
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of understand like just everything as much as possible as we think about how this all kind of comes about. So the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank, or they frame themselves as a conservative think tank. Typically, think tanks exist to create or imagine policies that can be implemented by the legislators that are aligned with them. So to a certain extent, they do a lot of research. Well, first they may think about their own their own thoughts around this is what we believe is necessary, or they do research to kind of think about what could be imagined. And in some cases, once they do their research and they kind of figure out, all right, this is the stances that we believe our government should take, they will essentially lobby or give recommendations to the politicians to say you should adapt these policies, right? And so if you adopt these policies, it will, help you win or it'll help you achieve your agenda. And from there, the elected officials make the determination if they want to absorb all those policies or if they don't want to absorb those policies because they realize that maybe it's negative to them. We can give examples of how Trump right now is trying to distance himself in some instances. So yes, in a technical sense, Trump could say these like the Heritage Foundation is separate from me as Project 2025, right? But I think the tricky part is, and I think this is where you see people are kind of having these conversations, is it feels like a little bit of a sleight of hand because there are a lot of people who worked for Trump's previous administration that helped to shape these policies. So there is the assumption that if Trump wins, he will be encouraged or forced or whatever language is used to implement these policies because there are individuals that are already kind of creating the framework that allows these legislators to kind of adopt it. And it's important to keep in mind there are think tanks that influence Democratic legislators. So it isn't something that is out the ordinary. And in some instances, some of the policies that are being promoted by Project 2025 are things that have been presented before, right? When you talk about Medicare, when you talk about dismantling Department of Education, I think it's been packaged in a way that allows people to kind of quickly absorb it, right? Because now it's like, oh, it's not just this, it's like a whole presentation, Project 2025, right? And I don't want to necessarily, I want to be careful not to necessarily say good or bad. I leave that to the audience. But I think I think it's important to kind of recognize that these are things that in some instances are not new, and in some instances have been implemented by the previous administration, and there are opportunities that more of these policies could be implemented. And I think there's a good, I think one could make an argument that there's a good chance that these policies will be implemented because that's the effectiveness of these think tanks, right? Once again, it becomes this feedback loop. If a lot of the people that helped to shape these policies are now associated with the administration in one way or another, then they're going to probably take those policies that they did all that research on and figure out how to actually pass it.
So one thing I wanted to touch on, which I didn't mention earlier, is I'm sure we're all old enough and learned in social studies or history or whatever your class was called, back in elementary and junior high school, how government is intended to work. A democratic government is intended to work, right? So the presidents they have power, right? But they're essentially figureheads, right? So they have an agenda that they put forth, and they can't just kind of operate well, they couldn't previously
Mhm.
operate, with no guardrails, right? And just kind of do whatever it was that they wanted to do arbitrarily. Um, the checks and balances in place are the legislative branch, Congress, and then the judicial branch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once again, that's how it's traditionally worked,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this agenda sort of seeks to kind of upend how that check and balance system works. Now, it could be a situation where you have a Republican elected to, to the presidency, and then, a Democratic Congress or Senate. And it's hard to get an agenda through nowadays when you have divided government. So it wouldn't necessarily be as easy. I think Fasson Couture made the point, that Congress and the Senate are kind of the guardrails, but there's a lot that's happened in the last couple of weeks that could, potentially impact the outcome. It could
Yeah.
be, a sweep of all three, um, well, I won't say of all three branches, but of Congress and the presidency. We already have a conservative leaning Supreme Court. It really all depends on the outcome of the election. So,
Yeah, I
um,
think that's, yeah, I do think that's something to think about when we think about, and I think something I see a comment that talks about, does Trump agree with these policies or not? And I think we have to ask ourselves, because right now he's trying to distance himself from it. So the question is he distancing himself because he sees the smoke, or is he distancing himself because he actually doesn't agree with it, right? And I think that becomes the challenge, because to a certain extent, these think tanks, they sometimes will give you the legislation to be adopted. And yes, as a president, you could say, I choose to adopt it, yes or no. But one could potentially make the argument that, like, the if the president wants to be seen as successful, he may want to consider these policies, some, if not all, because the research has been done to try to justify that they're valuable, right? So, an example, um, right? We've seen Trump in the past. He selected the Supreme Court judges who ended up ruling Roe versus Wade, right? And now, what does that mean? These decisions there were federal protections around Roe versus Wade, and now it's left to the courts, it's left to the states to decide. And so now we have this dichotomy where one state could be like, we're not giving any exception as it relates to abortion, and another state may say, we're going to give exceptions for race, rape, and incest, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Trump has tried to, and I looked at his agenda 47, to be clear, because Trump does have agenda 47, that is his campaign talking points. And so his talking points, he says, is I I I don't agree I agree that abortions may be necessary for rape or incest. But Project 25 doesn't agree with that. So now it becomes this tug of war around, like, all right, all these all these people that do the research, they're going to try to influence Trump to say, you need to pass this, right? And once again, we know that sometimes on the campaign, both Biden and Trump, or both Democrat, Republican, there could be a little bit of a bait and switch, right? Right now, Trump may be talking all that talk around, I support an exception, but what happens if he wins? Does he keep that energy, or does he just succumb to the policy people telling him, nah, you need to implement this, right? Like another example, like Medicare. Trump is saying, I'm not going to dismantle Medicare or Social Security. Project 25 is like, nah, we want to get rid of Medicare. We want to get rid of Social Security. So it becomes, once again, this tug of war of, like, is Trump truly about not dismantling Social Security, or is he only saying that because he's feeling the smoke? And I think that's part of the conversations that people gotta, talk about when they think about how they kind of internalize how these candidates talk about these policies, right? Because it's one thing on a campaign trail to say 1, 2, and 3, but what happens behind the scenes when you actually are in office and what you do. I think one of the things that we think about, I think one of the things I'll say, and I'll name this as myself, as an individual, right? One thing that I do think is a little bit scary as an individual, I'm speaking on behalf of Thomas, is the fact that they are looking to take federal government workers that are typically just civil servants and basically say those individuals need to be loyalists, right?
Yes.
Because these individuals that work for the federal government, they're in the state government, et cetera, like when you almost are supposed to just do the job of government. Even if you're Republican in voting and Democrat in voting, you are supposed to just execute the government. But what they're proposing is if you're not loyal to us, we're going to remove you and put people in a temporary basis, and you have to kind of pass this fealty test. And I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. I think, once again, myself speaking, one of the things that we recognize when we look at historically Black folks, think about PG County. How is PG County one of the wealthiest Black counties in America? That was federal jobs that Marion Barry, as mayor, was able to implement, and also pushing pressure on the federal government. So a lot of Black folks work in federal government roles. There's a potential that they will be told you're fired because you're not loyal to Trump. And so then Black wealth is going to be impacted because now Black folks are not able to take advantage of those federal jobs and work in those jobs, middle-class jobs, and building generational wealth. And that has the potential to be, negatively impacted. So once again, disclaimer, I named that as myself. I think that's pretty scary because federal employees, regardless if they're Democrat or Republican, are supposed to do the job of government. And if they're being told, nah, you need to pledge allegiance to me in order to keep this job, I think that's pretty scary.
Well, once again, I said earlier, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, right? And I concur. So we talked a lot about Trump, and I did say, as did Thomas, that the intent is to inform, not to cast a judgment on anyone's platform. Y'all are free to do that in the comments if you like. However, we we have a different agenda, right? The agenda is to inform, and then for you to take that information and research it further, or take the information that we're sharing and make a decision accordingly as to which candidate you think better aligns with your personal
Yeah. And I do want to add, when we think about Project 2025, I think one of the things we have to be also to remember is that a lot of attention right now is being placed on the policy agenda, but they actually have a 4-point policy pillar as it relates to Project 25, right? So it's the policy agenda, then there's the personnel database. So they're basic, and I'll read it. The most comprehensive policy agenda will have only limited impact without the right people in place to implement it. The project will cast a net across the country to identify conservatives from all walks of life to serve in the next conservative administration. So they're welcoming people, if you believe in that policy, to apply, and they're going to create a database of people that can potentially work for that government. There's a training program to train people to how to implement the policy, and then present a playbook, a 180-day playbook. Like, in 180 days, we believe that if Trump embraces this agenda, he should implement these policies. So it's important, so that it's pretty robust. I think it's something that people have to really recognize, that this think tank, just like any other think tank, they get paid to do the research and really present this comprehensive plan as to how government should function. And yes, the legislature can choose yes or no to adopt it, but many times that's what think tanks are for, is to give these legislators their talking points. Like, yes, some of our politicians are policy wonks, but some of these elected officials are not steep in policy. They don't have the bandwidth. And I don't mean that in terms of intellectual bandwidth. I just mean that they don't have the time to dig into all these policies. So they rely on the think tanks to give them the talking points, to give them the framework as to how to implement these policies. And that's why it's important for us as individuals to leverage our education and leverage the knowledge that we're gaining to try to influence policies that benefit our community.
One other thing that I wanted to touch on within the Project 2025 agenda, which I think is important, and then we're going to go over, on the Democratic side, is that the one of the tenets is that they would only recognize traditional families by overturning a ruling Obergefell. I'm probably mispronouncing this, versus Hodges, in attempts to eliminate same-sex marriage and other LGBTQIA rights. So they have a very large voting bloc, very powerful lobby, very powerful community. These are things that should be taken into consideration when you're voting. Like, worked very hard to attain these rights and protections, and this Project 2025 agenda is seeking to take them away. But again, I'm not making a judgment on who you should vote for, just saying. Moving on to the Democratic side, now Peach Henry Photo had made a comment about how the Democrats message that I wanted to touch on, because I kind of want to talk a little bit about what's going on, with the party at the moment, after we talk about their proposed agenda. But it don't matter what the Republican Party leader does not matter, right? His supporters and and the electeds are going to fall in line, right? They are loyal to the soil. They're going to fall in line. On the Democrat side, not so much. Now, I don't know if a lack of loyalty is a good thing or a bad thing in this case, because at the end of the day, I think the Democrats' goal is to win the election and to maintain their seats and maintain control to advance their agenda. But if the party is in complete chaos and disarray, and you can't sort of decide on what the approach is, and we're less than a few months from election day, I'm just not kind of sure what's happening, or how they think that's the way to approach the situation. Like, whatever conversations are being had should probably have been had behind the scenes, and then you kind of come to an overall consensus of what's the best way forward. Not kind of all this publicly coming out and going against. Like, they do not, on the Republican side, they do not do that. They are in lockstep every step of the way, and for that, hey, my hat's off to them, right? I think.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Like, I think about, there's an organization called the Lincoln Project.
Mhm.
They're primarily comprised of former Republicans, or maybe still Republicans. They sometimes call themselves never Trumpers. A lot of them, when I've been listening to when they talk right now, they're, in some instances, they're riding for Biden harder than Democrats. And these are Republicans, because they're kind of like, yo, this is who we're rocking with. We made a commitment to whoever the Democratic person is, and we're riding with that person. So it is interesting to see how, there is this phrase that Democrats need to love their
I
candidates,
heard that.
and
Yeah.
Republicans kind of just be ride or die. Like,
Yeah.
they say who it is, and they kind of rock with them.
Well, yeah, because it's not, it's like I said earlier, the presidents are powerful to an extent, but they're figureheads. Like, there's a whole kind of machine operating behind them to advance their agenda. They cannot do things in a vacuum.
Yeah.
There's certain opportunities they have to issue executive orders, but that's not how this government was intended to function, right? You can't executive order everything your way through, your policy agenda. Um, Anyway, so just
Yeah, I
quick.
think one of the things, this is how I tend to think about it when I think about Democrat, Republican. I find, in my opinion, that Republicans or conservatives, they tend to be like, all right, these are the policy pillars. You either get down or lay down. And I think because Democrats tend to have to try to welcome more types of audiences in terms of diversity, in terms of gender, and things like that, they try to have this bigger tent that tries to welcome all these kind of competing factors. And so then, because you got to entertain all these people, it's hard to have everyone be 100% in agreement, because once again, you're trying to welcome all these different views, right? Black folks are thinking about this, or like moderate Democrats are thinking about this, or pro-business Democrats are thinking about that, right? And so then it becomes harder to kind of coalesce, because you have so many different policies that you're trying to entertain to represent this big tent, where Republicans tend to be like, these are the pillars, you either get down or lay down. And yes, there's diversity within Republican vantage points as well. But, you know, when you think about conservatives, their mindset is typically is limited government. So to a certain extent, that means a certain amount of pillars that we adopt, or a certain amount of implications. Now, of course, one can make an argument that they are, in some cases, they're limited government, in other cases, they're not limited government, when they think about how to, in some cases, they want big government to enforce certain policies. And I think, one could look at Project 2025 as that, you know what I mean? So I think that, unfortunately, I don't want to say unfortunately, but I think that's how I tend to think about Democrat and Republican, that Democrats tend to have to embrace so many different views that it's harder to coalesce.
I concur. I mean, I definitely think that makes sense. We want to be inclusive, but you're right. There's, like I had said earlier, on another point, everyone's not going to get what they want. So you have to identify kind of what the key priorities are that benefit the largest swath of, your supporters. And those are the agenda items that you should probably focus on first. But anyway, all right, so just quickly to review what is on the Democratic Biden platform, and this is in no particular order. It's addressing climate change, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, addressing crime and policing, so attempting to institute bans on assault rifles, to decrease the incidence of mass shootings. Um, there were at one point calls to defund the police, but he's shied away from, that because I think it was kind of tenuous,
Yeah,
and how they.
Yeah, I think with the defund the police, I think even with that, I think one of the things that we saw, yes, there were definitely some Democrats, I think maybe those that are just as Democrats, or folks that are more progressive, that were willing to adopt the framing of defunding the police. But in my opinion, at least, you didn't really see a lot of like mainstream Democrats say, we want to defund the police. It was the activists, right? And the activists, that's their job. Their job is to be activists and advocate for issues. But I think this goes back to the messaging, the conservative or Republicans were able to do a good job of tying Democrats to the issue of defunding the police, to make it be framed as Democrats embrace defunding the police, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, so I think that's that dynamic at play when we think about, is it what the administration or the campaign, the official campaign, or is it the activists in terms of where they stand on those issues?
Now, and again, I did start to say, because Ern, I think, said that that wasn't Biden's position, and you're right, that isn't what it said. I was just kind of reviewing what his platform was. It was something that was referenced,
Mm-hmm.
because he wanted to address crime and police reform, and there was legislation put forth, but again, you have to sort of, when you have a majority in Congress, and then you have the presidency, that's when you have to like try to advance agenda items that will never pass if you have split government. And that was for sure one of the things that maybe should have been prioritized, that wasn't in
Mm-hmm.
the early phase of his administration. But if they wanted to advance it, because that was DOA, once the Republicans took over Congress. But anyway, or I should say the House. One of his other agenda items is to build back the middle class by raising taxes on top earners, and increasing taxes on corporations from 15 to 21%. Um, Education, he attempted to address student loan debt, but again, it was something that he couldn't sort of do in a vacuum without support from Congress. So efforts to advance that agenda item were previously blocked. I think there's some version of it that exists now. Again, I'm suggesting that you all do your own research because this is a short time frame kind of that we have to talk about these. So I'd have to do my own research further to understand where it stands currently. Um, Foreign policy, addressing the conflicts that are happening between Israel and Ukraine. I'm sorry, Israel and Hamas. Pardon me, and then the war with Ukraine and Russia. Um, Healthcare, and I know that that's a very hot button issue. I really don't want to touch it, so I know I might have thoughts on that and the comments that you want to share. I'd rather not touch that. But anyway, um, healthcare, expanding the Affordable Care Act and reducing the cost of prescription medications, reproductive rights, restoring access to abortion rights nationwide, and access to the abortion pill, um, and addressing immigration, which again there was an attempt to do, during current um, his current tenure. However, that bill was blocked in the name of his opponent wanting to run, on that as an item, basically saying that Biden couldn't get it done. Um, so, um, and of course, there are issues like no president can address everyone's issues. Inflation is high, right? The cost of living is high. Everything has gone up exponentially. I feel like people forgot that we were in a pandemic. Maybe y'all forgot about that. Um, some of that is a residual outcome of the pandemic, and some people think, oh well, the other one was signing checks and passing out checks. We were in a pandemic, and he wasn't signing the checks. He wanted to put his name on it so it looked like it was coming from him. But I mean, come on now. But that's literally the kind of commentary I see on social media, that people think like, oh, Big T was giving us checks. I'm like, you know what? Okay, all right. I don't even know what to say to that.
Well, let's speak to the marketing, you know what I mean? I think that was something that was ultimately smart. I think, Trump not being a government person. I think one of the things that I see sometimes in Democrats that because they inherently care about government, they tend to like not recognize the other aspects. They tend to just do the work and not recognize the marketing aspect that needs to be done in order for everyday citizens to recognize what's happening or what's not happening. So, I think I saw in the comments I think there is a criticism that many would say exists within Democrats is how do you better communicate what you're doing so that people can see the impact, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, the COVID created the incentive to give out those checks, right? I think we have to recognize that it was that emergency.
mm,
But I think we then have to ask ourselves, if it was an emergency, would one party be willing to give those checks out just off GP, right?
and
Like,
hold on, because it was the congressional, it was the Democrats, right? Who now Trump didn't have to sign off on it, but I think he knew that that was going to be popular, right? But it was Congress who approved it, right? Just saying.
yeah, and I think, and so I think that's, but we have to be, that did happen during his administration, so one could maybe say that that's a win that he gets. But I do think we have to be cognizant of, is that a policy because they truly believe in that policy, or is that a policy because of the moment, right? Because one could also look at right now, there's a lot of states that are pushing that are testing guaranteed income, where they're giving out guaranteed income for people that, $500 a month, and a lot of these people are using it to pay bills. If you looked at who are doing that, it's typically coming from Democratic mayors or Democratic cities, right? So one could potentially look at that dichotomy and say, in a current situation, who's actually testing, quote unquote, giving out checks, right? And then determine, oh, is that a policy that's sustainable or not, right? And once again, that's an example of like a policy from a think tank that's trying to imagine a policy, right? A think tank is basically telling Democrats, hey, we believe you should be giving out checks because a lot of folks are struggling with paying their rent, affording they can't make ends meet. So if government gives out a check, maybe that can make the difference. And so then once again, that's where folks have to kind of think about what are policies that make sense or what are policies that don't make sense. And it's up to the citizens to kind of determine if that works or not, right? You see in the comments, some folks are saying that's communism, that's socialism. That may be true in that regard. And so then at the end of the day, the citizens can determine if that is good or bad policy. But a think tank is kind of testing it out, right? So I think once again, it's really about when we think about all of, when we think about Biden's like platform right now, he tends to, on his website, he's really emphasizing democracy. He's emphasizing growing the middle class. He's, emphasizing a fairer tax system. He does have a history of kind of talking about that, right? And so at the end of the day, folks have to then ask themselves, is that possible? Yes or no? Does it depend on the three branches, the government in terms of the legislative branch and the House and the Senate? That's why a lot of parties want to have control of the executive branch and the legislative branch, because it makes it easier to kind of pass those legislation and not have to do executive orders, right? The student loan is a perfect example. Many of that student loan forgiveness that has been implemented has been done by executive order because he did not have the legislative opportunity to pass it. And so executive order is, one could say, is better than nothing, but at the end of the day, the executive orders can be reversed versus you want legislation like the Affordable Care Act that was passed through the legislature. So that's harder to reverse because it was passed by both the House and the Senate and then signed by the government, right? And so at the end of the day, that makes things harder. And I think, one of the things we do have to think about is like, what are the needs of the community, right? The Affordable Care Act is another example. A lot of states, like, this is where state government is critical, because in certain states, they have passed the Affordable Care Act and have implemented that. And there are certain states that are not willing to pass it. And for whatever reason, they are, there's a lot of there are a lot of uninsured individuals that are being impacted by the Affordable Care Act. And then there are states that, when it was labeled Obamacare, said it's trash, but when it was labeled Connect in Kentucky, for instance, when they didn't frame it as Obamacare, the citizens of Kentucky actually wanted it. So once again, the messaging. So it makes things kind of funky, but that's why it's really important that we got to really be in tune with the policies and the potential impact. And once again, as Black folks, kind of think about what are the needs of our community. If
I'm sorry, just really quickly
no,
to that point, when we spoke earlier, and you've touched on it a couple times in this conversation, is like, I'm asking people, what are your priorities when you vote? Are your priorities, the overall platform? Are your priorities economic issues, kitchen table, issues? Is it the price of gas, the price of groceries? Is it the stock market? Is it, which of course is booming? Is it social issues, abortion, or educate, like what are the issues that drive you, that make you say, yes, I want to vote for this person? Or is it, this is somebody I can have a beer with, like, he's a cool guy, I like him, he tells it how it is. Okay.
yeah. Yeah, and even with that too, there's some people that are like one issue
Yeah.
voters, and then there are some people that look holistically on politics, right? So there's housing, there's healthcare, there's economics, there's criminal justice, environmental justice, democracy, the Supreme Court. I see someone just put in the chat, the Supreme Court. That's critical, right? The next president has the chance to potentially pick 2 to 3 Supreme Courts, right? And so we've seen the impact of the Supreme Court in terms of the rulings that they make, right? And so at the end of the day, once again, there are some folks, like for instance, there are some people that they talk about Second Amendments and they're like, I'm a Second Amendment voter and that's all I care about and that's how I vote. That's their freedom to do so. But then there are other folks that look at these policy issues more holistically. And I do think, in my opinion, as an organization that does advocate for policies that speak on behalf of Black people, one, you got to ask ourselves, what is the makeup of Black people, right? Like, once again, we know Black folks they represent the full economic ladder. There's rich people that are Black, there's poor people that are Black, there's a lot of folks in the middle class. In some instances, it depends on your state, right? In Mississippi, as I see in one of the comments, healthcare may be critical because currently they don't have healthcare access. They didn't implement the Affordable Care Act. So in some instances, that may be a big, big issue. But in another state, healthcare may not be as big of an issue because they did implement Affordable Care Act. So, once again, I think, and once again, as a community, I think that's one of the things that we do have to wrestle with is like, are we thinking about our personal self or are we thinking about the whole community, right? When, I'll give a perfect example. I'll name it. In education, you have issues that some folks may resonate with education in terms of public schools and the need for public schools. And then at the same time, like an example, I'll name it. I was trying to be careful to name it, but I think it's a perfect example.
Don't get in trouble though.
This is personal, right? We have our daughter in a religious school, in a Catholic school, right? And so I tend to believe that I'm a proponent for public schools. But my wife kind of hit me up and was like, I don't know if you might want to think about some of the voucher programs because our kid is not in a traditional public school, so we could potentially benefit. And it really caught me. I was like, oh shit, damn. Like, I could benefit from vouchers, but I personally believe that public dollars should be used for public education, right? And so that's a perfect example of how I could personally benefit from vouchers, but I recognize the potential ramifications if we consider vouchers, right? And now that's a different conversation around public schools and public charters. And once again, that's another divide that exists amongst Black folks because we know that many of our kids have been in charter schools, many of our kids in the traditional public schools. So I just give that as a personal example to show something that could benefit me personally has the potential to impact the broader Black community. And that's not an issue that I'm willing to make, right? But there are others that are willing to say, nah, it's about my kids and I want vouchers, right? We see it in Pennsylvania. I know there was a lot of news most recently with Jay-Z and Rock Nation. With it's tough because I don't want to necessarily put that on Hove, but he is associated with Rock Nation, even if he doesn't, he may not be directly involved with it, but Rock Nation was hired to help promote the voucher program that is being proposed by some think tanks on the conservative side in Pennsylvania, right? And so, once again, now it becomes this conversation around Black folks. The argument being made by conservative is Black folks deal with public schools that are trash, and so they should take that money and go into whatever private school, religious school, what have you, right? But the argument on the flip side is the voucher money may not be enough. And so at the end of the day, if you're dismantling public schools because you're telling a kid they can take that money to go to a private school, but then they can't afford that private school, then their money isn't being utilized the way that is being imagined, right? So then once again, that becomes a perfect example of how to think about the topic of education when we recognize in many cases some of our public schools haven't been able to help us in a way that we believe is necessary. But is it enough to consider vouchers, right? Especially when in Pennsylvania, the organization sued the government and the judge ruled that Pennsylvania has undercut its funding. Meaning, in Philly, for instance, Philly kids are being denied up to $5,000 per student in money because of the way Pennsylvania funds its schools. So that's an example of how one has to make the argument: is the issue in Philly schools because they're being underfunded, or the issue the fact that Pennsylvania, they're not performing well? And once again, I don't want to go into too much in that rabbit hole, but I just wanted to name that example of how our personal politics can potentially conflict with the politics of the broader Black community, however we define that Black community.
I would say personally for myself, I'm more of I'm looking at the overall platform. Like what's more aligned with my like my belief system, and like my, moral compass or whatever. And that's
Yeah.
all I have to say about that.
No, I
So
tend to, I name that. I tend to think about it holistically as well, because once again, we as a community can't be just a one. In my opinion, we can't just be a one issue voter, right? Like there are a lot of issues that impact our community: education, healthcare, environmental health, economics, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be well versed in all of those aspects. I don't think we have the freedom. I don't think we have the luxury to be a one issue voter, because we are impacted by multiple issues. And so what it means is we kind of have to, a little bit of a give and take. We have to think about how much of this issue, what is the issue, how much we care about it. And then another issue, we might not care about it as much, right? A perfect example, a lot of times people will say they care about the economy, but but they end up voting based off abortion. So at the end of the day, we do have to ask ourselves, what are issues that we care about? How intense do we care about that issue? And I do see in the comments someone talked about the Black agenda.
yes, I wanted to
There are
I wanted to touch on that. Yeah. So
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, there are organizations that have presented an agenda. I know the National Urban League, they presented the Main Street Marshall Plan, that kind of similar to the Heritage Foundation, a bullet, like a 14, it's not 900 pages, but it is a healthy document that I do know that the CBC adopted and tried to leverage it in their recommendations. So there are organizations, the Black Economic Alliance, they are a think tank that talks about the private sector and recommendations that the private sector could be doing to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there are entities that are out there that do present policies that they believe, once again, that should be implemented on behalf of Black people. And these are entities that are nonpartisan, right? So at the end of the day, these are policies that can be adopted by Democrats or Republican if they choose to do so, if they believe that they want to support Black
Well,
people.
I was gonna say, but like once again, um, you reference this one entity. Is this being parroted? Because another thing that they are good at on the conservative side is parroting those talking points across multiple organizations, across multiple electeds, multiple platforms. It's the same talking points across the board. Um, I don't necessarily think that's true on the Democratic side, but to your point, it's probably because we're trying to engage a broader coalition, and so there's so many different agenda items that they're looking to capture, and it's such a like wide ranging and diverse group of people that they're trying to appeal to. So
Yeah,
maybe it's not quite as simple.
yeah,
I
no,
don't know.
no, definitely. But I think what it does do, though, and I kind of want to pivot slightly on this. It helps. It's a reminder for us to kind of understand all of politics and the opportunities to kind of push. So, an example. There's, there's political PACs. Political PACs inform or support the politicians. Then you have your 501c4s that support policy. Then you have your 501c3s that develop programs, right? And so I would make an argument that in our communities, we have too many 501c. We don't have enough 501c4s. Let me phrase it that way.
What is that?
Right? A 501c4 is a type of nonprofit organization that gives you greater freedom to propose policy. So an example, the NRA, they have a 501c4. So they can, the Planned Parenthood, they have a 501c4 along with the 501c3. But on the 501c4, those organizations can give a report card, right? So for instance, the NRA, you hear politicians will say, I have an A rating from the NRA.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because of the structure of the NRA, politicians want that ranking. And on the flip side, Planned Parenthood, there are politicians that want an A rating from the Planned Parenthood because it's a signaling aspect. As a 501c3, you can't do report cards because of the way you get your tax breaks as a nonprofit. And so I would make an argument that we need more 501c4s so that we can bring greater accountability to the elected officials. The NAACP, they do have a 501c4. They have the freedom to grade the politicians. And I do think like 5 or 6 years ago, they did create a scorecard, a civil rights scorecard, where they graded all the federal legislators on their policy priorities. And so
I know that, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just really quickly, I know that, we're not a monolith, right?
yeah.
But is there an entity that we would agree, like Greg has mentioned the NAACP, for instance, or I think Russell mentioned the NAACP. Is there an entity now that we sort of look at as like the premier organization representing the interests of Black people that we could funnel, funding into that exists already, or we'd have to create some whole new entity? It has to establish itself. It has to become a household name, or people have to become more familiar with it in the same way they're familiar with some of these Republican organizations, in order to ensure that they're advancing the agenda. And I guess the funding got to come from
us or from people that support.
Once again, that's part of the problem.
If we're not cutting the checks, then those entities are going to get the money elsewhere.
Exactly. And then whose agenda are they advancing?
And so to that point, like,
don't get
make sure
yourself into trouble, man.
You see that pause? You see that pause, right? So yes, I think that there are entities that propose policies that are conservative leaning and policies that may be viewed as progressive leaning, right? Now, I would say, in my opinion, organizations like the National Urban League, the Joint Center, the Black Economic Alliance, African American Policy Forum, they have had a track record of engaging with the politicians and giving them policy white papers or giving them talking points, things like that, right? So they have a history. Now, I see a comment, some people feel like they may not be doing as much. I leave that for the comments to kind of determine that for themselves. But part of the argument that I would say maybe as a pushback is those are spaces that probably need more dollars and more people being in tune to kind of champion those policies if you believe that those are policies that are important to our community, right? Like I do, I've been involved with the National Urban League, so maybe that's my bias, but they have proposed like a full Main Street Marshall Plan. Like they did the research, they gave recommendations based on the years and decades of work that they've done in terms of understanding the pulse of Black people, right? Like black folks, moving black folks into the middle class and beyond. And I would make the argument that the National Urban League, while a civil rights organization, is probably a little more conservative leaning compared to some other organizations that are much more, one could label radical or more progressive or whatever. And that, and that comment is my opinion. But when you look at like historically what the National Urban League has kind of championed has been economic self-sufficiency, moving black folks into the middle class. One could make an argument that helping people buy a home is a conservative principle. Creating more homeowners is maybe conservative. One could maybe make that argument, right? So, but is that, but at the end of the day, is that conservative, or is it about black folks recognizing that America has basically built, America middle class has been built off of home ownership. And we have seen historically our community been denied opportunities from the government to build wealth, generational wealth through home ownership. And so that's why you are seeing conversations. I think Vice President Harris has been on this world tour, on this country tour, trying to emphasize that. Or the administration, I know Marsha Fudge, when she was the Secretary of HUD, she was really looking at how do we look at appraisal discrimination. And, I think you might have seen black folks, when like appraisers will go into homes and they can look at the pictures and be like, oh, these are black people here. We're going to depreciate the value of their home. Yep. And you literally got black people putting pictures of white people, or have white people in their home to make it look like it's white people there in order to increase the value of their home. Mm-hmm. Right. So there has been initiatives by government to try to address that. Right. And so I think, I guess I say all that to say, there are entities that are pushing for policies that they believe speak on behalf of the broader black community. But, as I named, there are entities that have more of a conservative leaning that are starting to pop up to try to talk about that they believe these are the issues that matter to black people, right? And so at the end of the day, I think at the end of the day, we as individuals, we have to tell ourselves, like, where do you stand on policy pillars? What are policy pillars that you champion? And thus, how do you then find the organizations that do the work that align with your work? Like for me, I believe in building generational wealth. I believe that we have to, help our communities get access to homes, to build wealth, so that we can then start small businesses, because if we start more small businesses, we're more inclined to hire our own people. If we have generational wealth, we can then start to buy our homes back in Newark and Philly and all these cities that are quote unquote being gentrified. How do we continue to buy our homes? We need to own the homes so that as these neighborhoods flip, we can benefit from the appreciation of home value that will happen in those neighborhoods that are being flipped or that are being redeveloped, right? Because what we see in America is cities are becoming the center, right? I always think about, I'm becoming a long-winded, but I want to end on this point. I had a mentor make this point. If you want to know what America will look like, look at Europe and wait 40 years. America will replicate Europe. And so I've never been to Europe, but what he told me was, when you look at European cities, the rich people live in the cities and the poorer people live in the outskirts. And what we're seeing now in the United States is wealthier people moving into DC, moving into Brooklyn, moving into Harlem, and really pouring money into the cities, and it's pushing poorer people out to the suburbs. And so folks that are thinking about real estate, you're starting to see them recognize, like, damn, New York is a wrap. I can't afford to be in New York. Let me buy homes in Cleveland. Let me buy homes in Trenton. Let me find homes in areas that are starting to flip, because they're recognizing that wealthier people of all races are moving into cities, and it's pushing people out into the suburbs.
You said a lot. So the thing is, we could go on and on and on for a long
Yeah, yeah.
time.
A lot of, like I said, there's a lot of issues, and I
So
think we
so
just got to recognize how to tap in locally.
so maybe we need to, to do a part two on
Oh
this in a few
yeah, no
weeks,
doubt.
closer to the election, because there were some questions. You raised the point about um, building generational wealth and um, addressing the youth, educating the youth, and ensuring they're moving towards a path of success and understanding how the system works and how to you know maximize their opportunities within the system, which is easier to say when you're coming from a position of, you know, not wealth, but like where you have access to opportunities. A lot of, folks in our community are struggling. They don't have those opportunities handed to them. So they have to, sort of like scrape and scrap to try to get to them. But we need to talk about, I guess, how we're educating youth on these issues because they're the next generation of voters and people that are going to influence, these agendas moving forward. Somebody also mentioned the church, um, and said that they've been silent. Now, one thing that we kind of touched on, was like what's going on with the Democratic Party right now.
Yeah,
So I don't know
yeah.
I don't know if you have any commentary on that before we wrap up here, or if you want to lead out one alone.
It'll be interesting. I think it feels like, this is my opinion. It feels a little bit like a drip, drip,
Mhm.
drip. And at some point, I think there's gonna be enough people that's gonna try to push Biden out. Um, it's tough, you know what I mean? He has the votes, he has the money, so it's his decision to make. I do want to say this though, and I think this is something when we think about planning, right? Um, if Biden wins, he can't run again, right? If Trump wins, he can't run again. So what that
He's not going to leave.
means? Well, yeah. So there's that. If some people do believe that, but let's just say he does honor government and says, "I in 2028 I'm out because I reached my term." From my understanding, that means that in 2028, both Democrats and Republicans will have a robust
Hmm.
primary because Biden can't run again, and I don't think Trump can run again. I don't think Trump can run because that means he's done 8 years, right? Even though it was separate. I know you're still making that face, right? But once again, if he does that. So I say that to say 2028 is about to be wide open. And if black folks are like, yo, we need to have our influence, we need to start to flex our muscle, 2028 presents an opportunity for communities to really mobilize, right? A lot of folks want to be independent. One of the challenges that exist is that a lot of states have closed primaries. So what does that mean? If you identify as an independent, you can't influence the Democratic primary election or the Republican primary election. You can only pick independent candidates in the primary. So one could make an argument that if you want to be independent, you should be pushing for open primaries. Because if you have open primaries, that allows you to be like, bet I'm an independent and I can pick who's the best Democrat in the primary or the best Republican in the primary and begin to influence, right? So that is an example of like, how do we think about civic participation beyond the politics of like picking a candidate? Because there's a lot of policies that we can begin to push if we were able to think about the policies and not just get so caught up in like the Biden and Trump, right? Because yes, picking the president matter, but it's also thinking about how do we think about democracy and how do we think about pushing um the current levers by overwhelming the system and being accountable and being involved, right? One of the things that we always have to remember is that no, no politician is going to teach you the game because no politician wants you to replace them. So we have to own our own civics. And the knowledge is out there in this day and age that we can get that information if we choose to, right? Like I did see in the comments before, in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, we relied on the churches. We relied on the institutions to kind of give us that knowledge because we didn't have the internet to find it ourselves. But we have the opportunity to find that information, right? If we choose to. Secondly, I think sometimes when we think about civics, we make it feel like everyone who's participating has to be the next Malcolm X or Dr. King. And for a lot of folks, they ain't trying to die, right? And so, to a certain extent, those are lofty individuals that make it feel like, damn, that's too much. I ain't really ready for that. And so then they don't participate at all. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that I want people to recognize is like, you could still do your day parties, you could still sip on that Henny, you could still kick it and contact your legislator, right? Because here's a little secret. That politicians will come into the community, they'll do like the day party, or they'll do the community day, right? And they'll do the backpack giveaway, and those are all things that they do, right? And we in the community think, I bet that's the moment that I'm going to tell my politician about my issue or what I care about. But that politician honestly ain't really listening at that moment. They're doing so many other different things, or they'll tell their assistant, I get that person's email and whatever. But what politicians do listen to is every Monday morning they ask their staff, who called me and for what issue? Who emailed me and for what issue? And you have to keep track of that because that's their constituents, right? And so we need to think about how do we overwhelm in other ways to make our voice heard, right? An example, if we march and protest, who's collecting the zip codes of all the attendees at a march? Because a politician could easily say, nah, those are not my voters, those are some other people. But when an organization could be like, nah, homie, 1,000 people attended this march, 900 of them live in your zip code, I can prove it to you. Those are your constituents. How are you going to respond to that, right? I do believe that a lot of politicians, they are looking for ways to avoid accountability. And so we have to recognize what are the ways that they are held accountable and use those levers to bring that accountability, right? Once again, if an issue like housing, if they can feel, damn, 10,000 of my residents care about this issue, I need to make a decision one way or another because if I don't, they'll vote me out. And one of the things that we see is our people are not using all the levers, so that gives them freedom to ignore us because they can easily say, nah, y'all don't care about this issue. You didn't call me about it. You didn't email me about it.
The squeakiest wheel gets the oil. So right? I'll remember that. So you want to, be a bugaboo, right? I mean, in essence, that's what he's saying. Now, I don't think you should bother them with like nonsense, right? It should be, issues that are important to you, right?
Yeah. But it's also, it's also knowing who handles what, right? Like, who handles potholes? That's a local issue. Who handles school funding? That's a state issue. Who handles abortion rights? That's typically a federal issue or a state issue, right? So at the end of the day, it's about knowing how to push what lever of government, like how to understand, what's the issue that I'm trying to address? How can I potentially tackle it? Is it a local issue? Is it a state issue? Or is it a federal issue? And then once you recognize, and in some instances, some issues are multiple. The state will attack it one way, the federal will attack it another way, even though it's the same issue. So I think, once again, I would just encourage us to recognize, like, you can still do what you do, you can still kick it, and still hold your elected official accountable. Like, there's literally systems in place online and internet resources that, like, you could be at your brunch at a day party, send a text to your elected official, and still finish that mimosa in one fell swoop. Like, that's how much technology has given us an opportunity to do those things. And I think that's something that we have to leverage in our best interests. Like, it's not like there's so much technology out there that we could be making our voice even heard, even stronger if we choose to do so.
And on that note, I want to thank you so much because you had a lot of really valuable insights and information to share with my followers. I'm sure some of the folks on here are your followers. Hopefully, you gained some new ones. I pinned Thomas's IG in the chat, so make sure you go follow him and his organization. That's the New Jersey Black. My thing closed. Sorry.
No, Black Empowerment
Empowerment.
Coalition.
I couldn't remember what the E was.
Yeah, New Jersey Black
Sorry.
Empowerment Coalition. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. We're all over all over the social medias. But once again, I really appreciate the conversation. Hopefully we were able to kind of give folks the recognition that, like, this shit ain't a game. We got to tap in, regardless of where you stand. Obviously, like we said, folks may have their own individual views as to how they think about this upcoming election. But it's really important that we tap in and really just be engaged, because at the end of the day, government's gonna continue to cook if we
Hmm.
participate or we don't participate, right? At the end of the day, we got to be involved, and they're using our tax dollars. So at the end of the day, we should be involved. We should be paying attention, because our tax dollars are being used to determine whatever they want to determine, or what we believe needs to be determined, by being in the game and creating accountability and being involved. So I definitely want to salute everyone in all the comments, folks kind of chopping it up, and hopefully we'll, kind of have that part two in the future.
Absolutely. So, we'll kind of focus it on another election related, or, politics, civic engagement, some other topic. Maybe I'll survey the people to see what y'all want to talk about relative to my guest here. Um, and I thank you again. So make sure you go follow him. And good night. You can see yourself out. I'm going to have my final commentary and I'm going to sign off.
No doubt. Take care, everyone. Peace.
So, once again, thank you, Thomas, and thank you all for, hanging on this extended version. I know it's been a minute since I've been here, so I appreciate y'all as always. As Thomas said, in the late great words of DMX, this ain't no effing game. You think they playing? Y'all better get to them polls, and hopefully you're all already registered. I don't know what the deadline is, but if you're on the fence, hopefully you learn something that helps to better inform your decision as to, which platform, party, candidate, you choose to vote for. um we can't afford to be ignorant or apathetic. We need to be engaged, and um that's all. So I thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening. Out. Peace, two fingers.